Well, yes. All right. First, I want to do some board work. Fraught with symbolism there. Christianity has Christ in it. That's just a little tip off right there. Okay. This is a discovery learning class. And we're gonna put things together and see what we get. Because that's how the Bible does stuff. It starts with Genesis, goes to Revelation, you put stuff together, you figure stuff out. That's what we're planning to do. Okay? So, with that said,
Start with Genesis?
Huh? Let's go to Genesis. Exactly. And we're going to combine. I got visitor cards here. I'm going to lose them. There's another one. They're everywhere. They just keep popping up. Okay. We want to do some bookends, kind of, sort of. It's not like Genesis and Revelation, but it's bookends nonetheless. Let's go to Genesis 1 and 26 and 27. Familiar passages. So, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God made man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So that's our first thing. It has been observed, especially of recent years, by people who write about these things, that this in the culture of the time of Genesis would have been understood that God is choosing male and female to be his image bearers, to represent him, if you will. Now, that said, let's go to Romans 8:29. So we're created in God's image. And in Romans 8:29, we get sort of the rest of the story that we're going to be filling in as we move along. Romans 8:29. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Okay? So, we're created in God's image. We're to be image bearers. We are to represent him. He's made us so that we can be like him, if you will. And the way that we're supposed to be like him is the way that we're to be like his Son. Now, it's time to ask questions, get rousing discussion going.
What does it mean exactly on that verse 29? What does it mean?
Okay.
Romans 8:29. What does it mean? He foreknew and predestined to be confronted to the image of his Son.
Okay.
Is he referring to Adam or is he referring to Jesus?
He's referring to Jesus.
Okay.
Okay.
So who did he foreknew to predestinate?
Okay, that's a good question. And notice here that we have foreknowledge before predestination. We have friends in the religious world that talk about predestination. This talks about it, God determining something prior to the thing, but here talks about it that he foreknew before he predestined. To be conformed to the image of his Son, and in this case he's talking about Jesus, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren, that there would be a lot of people that would be like Jesus. So we're creating his image so we have capacity to be like him. He's not telling this to elephants and giraffes, mind you. He's talking to human beings created in his image. So this is where it gets, God is God. You may quote me on that. And there are mysteries or things that we can't fully comprehend because we're not. But there are things we can understand about what we can't fully comprehend. And so we can't fully wrap around the fact that God can know everything about everything all the time.
Why can't we?
Well, it's just big. Maybe you can. Maybe we finally found the. Yeah.
Some people can.
Some people can. But okay.
I think we can't understand how he can.
Yeah.
We
can accept that that's the truth.
We can accept that that's the truth, but not understand
Yeah.
how he does it.
Because we don't
We're-
function
We're
that way.
confined by time.
Yeah, we are.
In space.
In space, we just have a limited, and God does not have a limited. God has got everything taken into account. He's everywhere. There isn't any place He isn't. There isn't any time He hasn't been. And that blows your mind, because how can a being operate past, present, future, everything all at once? I don't understand how that works, but I know it works because that's how God works. At the burning bush, for instance, in Exodus 3 and 6, both of those chapters, it talks about these things. When Moses goes to the burning bush and he sees this bush and it's not being consumed, he finds out, we find out later that this is a representation of God, an angel, but is representing God. We find out in Hebrews. But so he wants Moses to do something. He wants him to go to Pharaoh. And this is somewhat disturbing to Moses, because Moses had already been like on the run from Pharaoh because he killed somebody and he hightailed it out. But he's kind of trying to come up with what I think are probably excuses. And one of them is, I'm not an eloquent person and my brother's better than I am. But here, he says, they're going to ask me who you are. And if you'd been talking about the Egyptian gods and goddesses, a particular one would be over something and would represent something. So Moses says, they're going to ask me who's sending me. So what should I tell them? And he says, I am has sent you, which is a very interesting. Translating it is interesting. I am's good enough because it means the absolute I am. Well, what about back then? I am. What about now? I am. What about over yonder? I am. What about in the future? I am. What about anywhere? I am. So it's the all-encompassing presence of God. And so here, when he does that, he says to Moses that he had used a covenant name when he was dealing with Abraham. Abraham knew about the name that we'll get to in a moment, Jehovah, as we sometimes call it, which is probably dangerously close to right. And he said, back then, my covenant name, or the name that I made covenants with people with, like Abraham, was El Shaddai. He said, but now I'm going to start using as my covenant name Jehovah. And the word, the verb from which we get I am, is the verb from which we get the noun that we call Jehovah. Probably Yahovah would be, because they don't have a J. When he tells Moses who to tell them is sending him, he gives him this name that includes everything. Now, the Egyptian gods and goddesses obviously didn't do that. They're limited in space, they're limited in time, they're limited to what they have authority over. But God's I am just covers everything as much as it can possibly be covered. And again, that blows our mind. But we can accept the fact, well, that's true, even if I can't relate to it in myself, because I'm limited, that is nevertheless the case. So we've got God that way, and we've got us being created in His image, and we're not that way in that we are limited in space and time, but we are in ways that way. And so we come forward and we find in Romans, after the resurrection, that Paul talks about verse 29 of chapter 8, whom he foreknew, he predestined. God knew before, as we would think of it, he actually came. But in another way of looking at it, he knew because God knows everything. And whom he foreknew, he also predestined. He determined that this person, Jesus, whom he foreknew, he predestined would be the firstborn among many brethren. So God wants people to be like Jesus, is the short. Hence, Christianity has Christ in it, because that's what it is. Now, with regard to that, and God wanting people to be like Jesus, let's go to John. You're getting free stuff here. Everything's not in the handout. John chapter 14. Jesus is going to be talking to him in 14, 15, and 16, right before he gets arrested. And he starts off, let not your heart be troubled. He will deal with that some more, talking about the peace that he leaves with them and how in the world they have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. So he's introducing it because he's leaving. Everything that they've been depending on and their misconception of a Messiah, that a Messiah would not die, but would take rule and set up shop in Jerusalem and tell everybody what for, and the Jews would be like a privileged people. And so now I'm going. And that's really getting to them. But he says, don't let your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me, because of that affinity that they have with each other. So in my Father's house, we have so many songs about mansions, and this isn't the word for mansions. What he's saying is, in my Father's house, you could say there are many guest rooms, there are many rooms, there are many places to live, and I'm going to go prepare one of those rooms for you so you can live in my Father's house, which in the culture of the day, to some extent our culture, that's a pretty big deal. The God of all creation is going to invite you to come live with him in his house. How sweet is that? So he says, but I've got to go because I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. But if I go and prepare a place for you, I'm going to come back and get you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. This probably starts the early initial phases of it in the church and being a Christian, but goes on into eternity for the bigger part of it. So as we go down through there, Philip has a question about, well, if you're about to go, he's probably thinking there's some stuff we need to figure out. So he says, show us the Father, and it's enough for us. If you just do that, we'll be done. We'll have it underway. And Jesus says, he kind of chides him. He says, have I been with you so long? And yet you say, show us the Father? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. So what would God look like from our perspective if he were living in a body like us? He'd look like Jesus. What would he say? What would he do? What would be his priorities? On and on and on and on. However God would express himself in a human body is how Jesus expressed himself. So to be like him is our goal. And we couldn't have done that had he not come, because nobody had ever seen God walking around in heaven in earthly form. Back to John 1, verse 14. We're told that the Word, Jesus, became flesh. We're told up at the first couple of verses that the Word was God. So in the beginning with God, always been God. They're inseparable. Again, understanding all of that, I can't do that, but I know it's true. So, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among men. Pitched his tent is literally what it's, tabernacled among men. And we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Son of God. Now, go down to, there are 18 verses in the prologue to John's Gospel. Go down to the last verse, verse 18. And that kind of draws from that, the Word became flesh. It says, no man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who's in some manuscripts even say only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. So when Philip says, show us the Father, that we just read in John 14, and he says, well, here I am, where you been? He's been explaining him by showing how God would live as a human being. How would he react to things? What are his priorities? All that kind of stuff. So I pause here in case there's any discussion that we want to have. There may not be, of course. Okay, so our bookend. See, we're created in God's image. Jesus comes to show us what a person, a human being in God's image, would look like if they were God with us. Emmanuel, we have from Isaiah 7:14, when the virgin would give birth, and they call his name Emmanuel, which Matthew interprets for us. God with us. So one of the reasons Jesus came was to show us what it looks like to be the kind of person created in God's image that would be like God. And when it says whom he foreknew, he predestined, we're talking about this thing we call Christianity is really what we're talking about. What does that look like? Well, it looks like people who are going to live like Jesus, who are going to conduct themselves in his way. Okay? But something happens right almost off the bat, right, in chapter 3 of Genesis, which sets us up for the rest of the development, because the Bible is a book that's it's all together, and understanding how it flows along is important to do. Are you familiar? I'm going to give you a term. It's spelled S-P-A-T-I-A-L, spatial, which is what people in North Alabama call special. Ha ha ha. No, okay. Sorry, North Alabama people, but you do. You know you do. What is spatial? What is that? It's often said that Eastern people think more spatially, and Western people think more chronologically or analytically. So, and there's overlap. They both have both. But when you look at the Bible and you see how it presents stuff, it's not a neat little, there's some here and there's some there and there's some over here and there's some over there. It's in a spatial field. And it's there, and the Bible will give us information to help us see how it fits together. Okay, let's use an example. How many of you have ever worked a big old puzzle? Kind you dump out on the table and work on for who knows how long? Anybody ever done that? You're at least familiar with the idea that this happens, aren't you?
Yes.
So
Have one that's not put together
not
yet.
put together yet, but here it's getting there. So,
I stopped doing it. I didn't have the patience.
well, that's the thing, isn't it? I like those 5-piece puzzles myself.
I think I've done it.
Yeah, I got 3 of them. There's another one there. But if you dump the pieces out, just before you start matching up colors and all that stuff in pieces, that's the spatial field. All the information is there, but it's not in a neat little, like an outline or something like that. So what do you got to do? You got to put it together. And when you start doing that, you find things that seem to fit together. Like if there's this funky purple color, go on a search for all these funky purple colors and try to fit them together. Or a lot of people go for the straight edge pieces because there's going to be a border that your picture's going to go in. So a lot of people want to get the border established first. I bet that's what you did. Is that what you did? Come on, tell me. Okay.
did.
Okay.
The border's there.
Nobody's there. The hard part. And then you start working in from, the funky purple color may be up here, and look at this. So you're wanting to establish relationships. The Bible kind of gives us information about. Here's the Bible. Imagine. I'm just throwing it on the table. There it is, right there. Got all the pieces. So in order to construct the picture that it's giving us, well, we need borders. We don't want to be off over yonder. The border's over here. We need similar things, like the funky purple color, and what have you. Now, here's the thing. I'll bet you have the picture of that puzzle displayed before your very eyes. Is this correct?
This would be correct.
Okay. That shows you what it looks like when it's finished. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, we just did that a little bit, one of the things that we can do is read backwards. In other words, we can look and see what a part of the puzzle looks like up here that was put together by the pieces that came to there. So well, that's what it looks like. So one of the things, we know that in the biggest part of what we're wanting to know, what is Christianity, we want them to look like Jesus. That's the heart of it. So things in the New Testament that show us how he looked are kind of like, well, here's the picture here. So we say, oh, well, I see why that piece is there. That helps us to see this. Or, oh, there's one over there. It helps us to see that. because we're reading back into it. That's perfectly legit. It's not cheating or anything. Very helpful. Comments? Okay. That said, when we're looking at this spatially, let's just say we dumped all the Bible verses out there, and we start grouping together. We've already got a lot of groupings. Got books, and we got stories that fit together. So we got pieces that have content to them. And we know that all these pieces with content on them, in them, are supposed to fit together. They belong somewhere. Okay? Again, this reading backward thing. Do y'all read mysteries, like murder mysteries or anything like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you get to the, okay, I used to, but I got over it. When you get to the end and you find out, what happened and who did it, you probably say, well, I know why that was back there now. I know why that was part of the story. And they have what they call red herrings as well, which are things you might think are going to help you understand what's going on, but they really don't. They're a diversion. So one of the things you kind of figure out when you're looking at the Bible is you may try to put something in a part of the picture that just doesn't belong there. I mean, you have reason to think, well, maybe that goes there, but it doesn't. So you're kind of weeding out stuff when you're studying the Bible as well. When I'm looking at a particular thing, what actually goes there? And one of the things, you might do this too, is you put together pieces. Like here's an 18-piece piece, and here's a 5-piece piece, and here's a 14-piece piece. And you start assembling pieces that you put within the thing. It starts taking shape. And that's essentially what we're talking about. We're talking about the Bible. And again, our cheat sheet for the overarching what's going on here is Jesus. And the more we can understand him. Now, there's another thing about it, though. We understand more about him also from what led up to his being there. So not only do we have him there, we have things that led to his being there in the Old Testament that help us to better explain why, well, that's why he was that way. That's why that. And there are things that Jesus will do in his ministry that's sort of like, where have you been? God's been telling you this forever. So why are you surprised that I'm telling you the same thing? So.
Question.
Good.
So are there parts of the Bible that are less important, so to speak?
Yes, there are.
Okay. Like, you need all the pieces to make the puzzle complete.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got a picture of a cat, the cat is the main focus.
Right.
The background.
Yeah, there may be a leaf over there to the side, but so what?
So if
we
we learn what to focus on and
Right.
why this
Mhm.
is here, then this becomes less troublesome to try to memorize.
Yes,
That's what I'm getting at.
and you've done it quite well.
Okay.
That said, when we're doing that and we're wanting to concentrate, Jesus is teaching along the way. Say Sermon on the Mount, which is a key teaching place for him, where he's basically saying, let me tell you the essence of what this Old Testament is about, the things that are really important, the things that you really, really, really need to get in your life.
And you should have had it.
And you should have had them, by the way, but bless your hearts, you let those Pharisees mess you up. So now there are things that were important for a time, for instance, the temple.
Correct.
At a time, that was very important. There came a time where it was never to be, if you will, in its form of a building, an eternal part of God's plan. Now, in a spiritual sense, it comes into play. In fact, in John chapter 2, Jesus says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll... And it's like, and they're like, what? Been working on this thing for 46 years. You lost your mind. And he said, even his people don't understand it until he's resurrected. And then they realize that he's talking about the temple of his body. Because the temple concept was God dwelling with us. And Jesus is God with us. So the temple is a figure of that, and God being with his people. Jesus is that. And so you will not need to have the physical temple in the stone building, because Jesus is going to be it. And they're going to tear him down. They're going to crucify him. But 3 days later, there he is, built back up. So there are things like that play at times a major role in the story, but they get absorbed in Jesus. Typology is what we're talking about. Okay, let's go to Hebrews, shall we? Sure. Now, Hebrews is a book written to Jews who became Christians to show that Jesus is the one that they ought to be looking at, because you're getting pulled back into Judaism. And the Hebrews writer, whoever he is, or she, is wanting them to see, no, Jesus is the one you need to be looking at. And he shows how he fulfills all the things. So let's look at a couple of verses that tell us that in Hebrews. Hebrews 8:5. Hebrews 8:5. We could even have a vigorous reading of that when we're disposed. Are you disposed?
They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, for when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain."
Okay, so when God showed the pattern for the construction of the tabernacle and then later morphing into the temple, he was so, you do it like this, because these things represent heavenly ideas. Now, chapter 10 and verse 1 of Hebrews.
For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near.
Okay, so it's a shadow. One of our children was terrified of shadows. We tried every way we could to get him to see it's just the sun hitting something and it won't go through, but alas, it took a while. So, but a shadow gives you some idea of something, but it's not the substance of the thing itself. And the Hebrews writer is saying, when in the Old Covenant, when God's working with, especially Moses, and he was talking about stuff and revealing stuff, those things are like a shadow compared to what cast the shadow, the reality, the substance. And so, and again, what does he do but say, well, that's Jesus. The Hebrews writer is intent upon doing that. So, it gets us back to Jesus again, and how these things that come into play, and everything has a purpose for being there. Sometimes the purpose is just, if you will, filler. Woo! Did I say that? Yes, I did. Here's what I mean.
It's on camera, so yeah.
Oh, no! Just kidding. No. There's a guy in the Old Testament named Og who had a bed 9 feet long. That's a huge point, isn't it? No. So you run into things because you run into things. You could have run into something else and still had the point made. So it's like any book you read.
Red herring. It's the red herring.
Yeah. Don't go off on that Og thing, man. It's not a major player.
We've got to be careful to not get bogged down in the minutiae.
Yeah. And some people, it's not a Bible bow. Because Bible bow deals with minutia, right? It just, whatever, any little bitty thing, they're going to ask you a question. But that's not necessarily going to be a salvation question. It's not going to be a judgment question. It's there, but it's there like our lives. They have all kinds of, like, here we are. Incidentally, we're in this kitchen. We could incidentally be somewhere else having this same lesson. But we've got to be somewhere. So here's the stuff that's around us. So there's that in the Bible. It's the things of life that are there when God is weaving his story along. And there's got to be something there. And sometimes they're more important than others. And sometimes they're just incidental. So that's another thing. We need that for the story. If we just had a story with, here's the 5 points of Gone with the Wind. What? Maybe 15. But Gone with the Wind is a novel. It's a story that when you get to the end of it, there was a lot of things that were interesting and colorful and amusing perhaps, but there is a storyline that transcends the things that were there along the way. And the things that were there along the way help us understand it perhaps.
Makes it interesting.
Makes it interesting, engaging, because stories are engaging. That's why the Gospels and other things are stories, because people like stories. You remember stories. We're wired to tell stories. People have been telling stories. We tell our children stories and all that. And families have their stories. So back to your question. Some things are more important than others. And everything is not of equal weight. Look at Matthew 23:23, so Jesus can say the same thing because he knows stuff. Matthew 23:23. This is the scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites stuff. And he says, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, little bitty seeds, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law. Now, were they told to tithe? Well, yes. Is tithing the big player in this story? No, not at all. Jesus said, you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Compared to a seed separated out, justice just tears it up. Were they supposed to separate their seeds? Well, yeah. It's a principle of returning to God and giving God his portion. But they weren't the overarching things for how God wanted to deal with them. If they didn't have mercy and justice and faithfulness, nothing was going to work. And Luke, in his parallel, will add love to that as well.
Well, that goes back to the story of David in the field, plucking the grains. They were or the showbread, which they weren't supposed to eat, but it was better than starving.
Okay. Jesus calls up when they're criticizing him and his people. He says, do you remember? Well, first of all, he says the priests break the Sabbath every Sabbath. Technically, they work. They're not supposed to work. But if you take the system as a whole, they're supposed to work. They're the exception to the rule, so we don't whack them. Then he says, you remember how David ate the showbread, which Abimelech, he thinks they're starving, actually lied to him, but he didn't know that. And so Abimelech's got enough sense to know that the showbread you said was only for the priest wasn't to have people starve to death. And so he thinking that David and his peeps are starving to death, he gives it to them. He wasn't whacked for that, at least not by God. But so there are some things. Suppose you're driving to services one Sunday and you clip an old lady. She goes spinning off onto the ground. And you say, as you roll down your window,
I'm going to church.
I got to go to church. That's more important than you. You shouldn't have been out there in the road in the first place. But I'll be back in an hour or so. No, wait a minute. Maybe it'll be longer than that. And no, you're going to stop and help her. It's like the ox in the ditch on the Sabbath. You know, he didn't give it so you could watch animals slowly torture themselves to death or anything like that. So you have priorities, you have relationships, you have weightier matters that come out as you go along. And those are the things that come more to the forefront. And the other things, and Jesus said, these you ought to have done without neglecting the others. He's not saying forget about those tithing things. No, he's just saying there are things far more important than that, and you've majored on matters and matters on majors. He says, you strained out a gnat and swallowed a camel. And so there are things in what God had given prior to Jesus in the Old Testament that they had taken the minutia and made sure they didn't mess up that and neglected.
But they still mess that up.
They just messed the whole thing up.
Which is why we have it, to show that no matter how many rules that you've had,
It's not enough.
you're going to screw it up.
Yes. In fact, the more it's the rule thing, the further away you get from why there were rules in the first place. And you start applying them when they don't apply. Okay. What time is it? When is this over?
You got 5 more minutes.
Okay. That's another way of putting it.
Well, I Belgian time. I don't know what time it is. Huh?
I didn't hear it. I never hear it.
Yeah.
I heard
They
it.
may have to come drag us out yelling and screaming. Who knows? Okay. So any questions at this point? We're just looking at the big, here's what it is. We've got pieces and they're going to fit together. But Jesus, all of it is primarily getting us introduced to him and explaining who he is so we can be like him. That's the main thing. We've created an image of God. He shows us what God looks like in human form, and God wants us to be conformed to that image. That's the big deal.
Those are our bookends.
Those are our
Created
bookends.
in God's
Okay. Now, but as we said a moment ago, something happened right after he created us in his image. We went south, way south, down to Chile or something. Chapter 3, what happens of Genesis?
Satan.
Yeah,
Eve.
yeah.
Sinners.
And he said, I've heard that you were told you couldn't eat any of the trees. She said, well, no, there's just one. But now she's thinking about the one. Because what do we humans do with the one thing we can't do? Well, you start thinking about it. And he's been using this from that day till this temptation. God doesn't want you to know that because you'll be like him. You could be God. He's trying to keep God prerogatives away from you. I'm here to help you. Yeah. So she looks at it, and the way she looks at it, I mean, there's no reason in the world she should look at the fruit that way, whatever the fruit was. There's no reason in the world. But once she's been told that this is something that's going to make you like God, it looks different to her. Why, this will make you wise. Why would you think a fruit's going to make you wise? Because you want it to, And so the main sin, the main temptation was, God's trying to keep stuff from you. You need to be like God. You need to seize this. Hence, self-denial is going to be the besetting problem all through the Bible story, where people want to do what they want to do because they want to be God. Didn't work too well, however. So, there are 4 things that kind of happen after Eve and Adam sin. There are 4, we might call them separations. And the first one is between humans and God. Now, Eve said, she added, look at it, but the moment you'll die. Now, they ate it. Did they die? Well, it depends on how you're looking at it. And oddly, there's 3 different Hebrew constructions in the whole narrative between Adam and Eve and the serpent. And one of them is, you're dead. Another one is, you'll start dying and eventually you'll be dead. Now, in one sense, they died spiritually, immediately. They're gone. In another sense, what happens to them as far as their physical existence is concerned? They start dying. In fact, God says, these people, they're going to start getting conniving and all this kind of stuff. And they say, well, go to the tree of life and we'll just eat that. Ha ha. And say, no, I'm not going to let you go there. So they lived a long time, but they start winding down. They're gone. So Satan can kind of tell a sort of a truth the way he means it, and yet it's not the truth the way we ought to understand it. But there's separation from God and human beings. There's separation from us and ourselves. Adam's all, he's walking around. And there's separation between Adam and Eve. She did it. It's her fault. And there's separation between the world that God has given them to live in, which is just what they needed. And there's going to be thorns and thistles now. It's going to be rough. And we'll pick it up there and look at something. Take this, play with it, see what you can find.